All right, so we are diving into the heart, the blood, and the blood vessels today, aka our cardiovascular system. Um, actually, you know what? We'll do a little tour here before we dive into the video. So we're going to be talking about the structure, like looking at like the different tissue layers of the heart itself, different divisions and chambers and things like that. Understanding those chambers. Yeah, here's what's kind of funny. I always tell people this. You guys might remember me saying this in the past, but like, is it honestly the most important thing in the world for us? Like, does it affect the gym floor to understand all the chambers of the heart? If I'm being perfectly honest with you, not really. I mean, if you have a client with like a heart murmur or something, like they're going to be working with their doctor, So sometimes it's like, we spend a lot of time like memorizing these chambers and working on that. I will say it is not so much because it is something that comes up in the gym very often, but it is the type of information, it's the type of data that makes very good test questions. And so because of that, we kind of need to be prepped and we kind of need to be ready for those test questions when it comes to taking your NASM test. So, we're definitely going to be going over the chambers of the heart, getting all those memorized. And then we will also look at blood supply of the heart, your coronary arteries. That one is huge, right? That's a hugely important thing. I mean, disease of the coronary arteries is the #1 killer of people in the US. Then we'll look at the function of our cardiac cycle today, which will be really fun. How systole and diastole works, how we calculate heart performance. We talk about cardiac output. We'll talk briefly about the conduction system. You'll see that in the video that we're going to watch, which is kind of fun. Like how it's controlled and things like that. Not so much heart sounds. Again, like we're not going to be looking at that. We don't analyze heart sounds or anything. And diseases of the heart, we will talk very briefly about some of them. Coronary artery disease and heart failure and things like that. But again, like heart studies, that's not really our area. Certain diseases, not so much our area I mean, we know like disease prevention actually is kind of part of our area. Like obviously, like, ensuring that our clients are getting plenty of fiber in their diet, that they're getting healthy fats, keeping the cardiovascular system healthy. But that's not quite, exercising really. But that's actually not quite what these two things are actually talking about, weirdly enough. This is just mostly like medication stuff, which is not our approach. And so that is sort of like where we are headed here. Let's I'll pull that up and then let's go. All right. I love all their I love this title, Under Pressure. All right. Oh, and then share my sound. I always forget to do that. All right, here we go.
Your heart, that throbbing, beating muscle, is probably the most iconic organ in your body. No other organ gets its own holiday or as much radio play, and you're unlikely to get a love note decorated with a kidney or a spleen or even a brain, which is really what rules the emotions. Don't get me wrong, the heart does some great things. Namely, it powers the entire circulatory system, transporting nutrients, oxygen, waste, heat, hormones, and immune cells throughout the body over and over. But in the end, the heart does not make you love, it doesn't break apart if you get dumped by your boo, and it's not a lonely hunter. The truth is, the heart is really just a pump. A big, wet, muscly brute of a pump. And it doesn't care about poetry or chocolate or why you're crying. The heart has only one concern: maintaining pressure. If you've ever squeezed the trigger on a squirt gun or opened a can of shaken soda, you've seen how fluids flow from areas of high pressure, like inside the gun or the can, to areas of low pressure, like outside. The heart's entire purpose is to maintain that same kind of pressure gradient by generating high hydrostatic pressure to pump blood out of the heart while also creating low pressure to bring it back in. That gradient of force is what we mean when we talk about blood pressure. It's basically a measure of the amount of strain your arteries feel as your heart moves your blood around. More than 5 liters of it at about 60 beats per minute. That's about 100,000 beats a day, 35 million a year, 2 to 3 billion heartbeats in a lifetime. The basic physiology of which you can easily feel just by taking your own pulse. I don't have a watch. Now that might not inspire so much poetry, but it turns out it's still a pretty good story. let us begin with a little anatomy. Unless you happen to be of the Grinch persuasion, the average adult human heart is about the size of two fists clasped together. One of the few bits of trivia you often hear about human anatomy that is actually true. The heart is hollow, vaguely cone-shaped, and weighs only about 250 to 350 grams, a pretty modest size for your body's greatest workhorse. And although Americans tend to put their right hand over their left breast while pledging allegiance, the heart is actually situated pretty much in the center of your chest, snuggled in the mediastinum cavity between your lungs. It sits at an angle though, with one end pointing inferiorly toward the left hip and the other toward the right shoulder, so most of its mass rests just a little bit left of the mid-sternal line. The heart is nestled in a double-walled sac called the pericardium. The tough outer layer, or fibrous pericardium, is made of dense connective tissue and helps protect the heart while anchoring it to some of the surrounding structures, so it doesn't like bounce all over the place while it's beating. Meanwhile, the inner serous pericardium consists of an inner visceral layer, or epicardium, which is actually part of the heart wall, and an outer parietal layer. These two layers are separated by a thick film of fluid that acts like a natural lubricant, providing a slippery environment for the heart to move around in so it doesn't create friction as it beats. The wall of the heart itself is made of yet more layers, 3 of them. That epicardium on the outside, the myocardium in the middle, which is mainly composed of cardiac muscle tissue that does all the work of contracting, and the innermost endocardium, a thin white layer of squamous epithelial tissue. Deeper inside, the heart has a whole lot of moving pieces that I'm not going to pick apart here, because the really big thing to understand is how the general system of chambers and valves and veins and arteries all work together to circulate blood around your body. Of course, fluid likes to move from areas of high pressure to areas of low pressure, and the heart creates those pressures. Form, once again, following function. Your heart is divided laterally into 2 sides by a thin inner partition called the septum. This division creates 4 chambers, 2 superior atria, which are the low pressure areas, and 2 inferior ventricles that produce the high pressures. Each chamber has a corresponding valve, which acts like a bouncer at a club at closing time, like he'll let you out, but not back in. When a valve opens, blood flows in one direction into the next chamber, and when it closes, that's it. No blood can just flow back into the chamber it just left. So if you put your ear against someone's chest, and yeah, ask for permission first, you'll hear that lub-dub. Lub-dub. What you're really hearing are the person's heart valves opening and closing. It's a relatively simple but quite elegant setup, really. Functionally, those atria are the receiving chambers for the blood coming back to the heart after circulating through the body. The ventricles, meanwhile, are the discharging chambers that push the blood back out of the heart. As a result, the atria are pretty thin-walled because the blood flows back into the heart under low pressure, and all those atria have to do is push it down into the relaxed ventricles, which doesn't take a whole lot of effort. The ventricles are beastly by comparison. They're the true pumps of the heart, and they need big, strong walls to shoot blood back out of the heart with every contraction. And the whole thing is connected to the rest of your circulatory system by way of arteries and veins. We'll go into a whole lot more detail about these later, but the thing to remember first, if you don't already remember it, is that arteries carry blood away from the heart, and veins carry it back toward the heart. To differentiate the two, anatomy diagrams typically depict arteries in red, while veins are drawn in blue, which incidentally is part of what has led to the common misconception that your blood is actually blue at some point, but it isn't. It is always red. It's just a brighter red when there's oxygen in it. So let's look at how all this comes together, starting with a big burst of blood flowing out of your heart. The right ventricle pumps blood through the pulmonary semilunar valve into the pulmonary trunk, which is just a big vessel that splits to form the left and right pulmonary arteries. From there, and this is the only time in your body where deoxygenated blood goes through an artery, the blood goes straight through the pulmonary artery into the lungs where it can pick up oxygen. It finds its way into very small, thin-walled capillaries, which allow materials to move in and out of the bloodstream. In the case of the lungs, oxygen moves in and carbon dioxide moves out. The blood then circles back to the heart by way of 4 pulmonary veins, where it keeps moving to the area of lowest pressure, because that is what fluids do, and in this case, that's the inside of the relaxed left atrium. Then the atrium contracts, which increases the pressure, so the blood passes down through the mitral valve into the left ventricle. So the thing that just happened here, where a wave of blood was pumped from the right ventricle to the lungs and then followed the lowest pressure back to the left atrium, there's a name for that. It is the pulmonary circulation loop. It's how your blood unloads its burden of carbon dioxide into the lungs and trades it in for a batch of fresh oxygen. It's short, it's simple, at least in the way I have time to describe it, and it's just delightfully effective. Of all the substances you need to continue existing, oxygen is the most urgent, the one without which you will die in minutes instead of hours or days or weeks. But it's pretty useless unless the oxygen can actually reach your cells, and that hasn't happened yet. For that, that, your newly oxygenated blood needs to travel through the rest of your organ systems and share the wealth. And that fantastic journey, known as the systemic loop, begins in the left ventricle when it flexes to increase pressure. Now, the blood would like to flow into the nice low-pressure left atrium where it just came from, but the mitral valve slams shut, forcing it through the aortic semilunar valve into your body's largest artery, nearly as big around as a garden hose, the aorta, which sends it to the rest of your body. And after all your various greedy muscles and neurons and organs and the heart itself have had their oxygen feast at the capillary bed buffet, that now oxygen-poor blood loops back to the heart, entering through the big superior and inferior vena cava veins straight into the right atrium. And when the right atrium contracts, the blood passes through the tricuspid valve into the relaxed right ventricle and right back to where we started. This whole double loop cycle plays out like a giant figure eight, heart to lung to heart to body to heart again, and runs off that constant high pressure, low pressure gradient exchange regulated by the heart valves. So the first lub that you hear in that lub-dub is made by the mitral and tricuspid valves closing. And they do that because your ventricles contract to build up pressure and pump blood out of the heart. This high pressure caused by ventricular contraction is called systole. Now, the dub sound. And just to be clear, I'm not talking about dubstep sounds. That's the aortic and pulmonary semilunar valves closing at the start of diastole. That's when the ventricles relax to receive the next volume of blood from the atria. When those valves close, the high pressure blood that's leaving the heart tries to rush back in, but runs into the valves. So you know when you get your blood pressure measured and the nurse gives you two numbers, like 120/80. The first number is your systolic blood pressure, essentially the peak pressure produced by the contracting ventricles that push blood out to all your tissues. The second reading is your diastolic blood pressure, which is the pressure in your arteries when the ventricles are relaxed. These two numbers give your nurse a sense of how your arteries and ventricles are doing when they're experiencing both high pressure, the systolic, and low pressure, the diastolic. So if your systolic blood pressure is too low, that could mean that, say, the volume of your blood is too low, like maybe you've lost a lot of blood or you're dehydrated. And if your diastolic is too high, that could mean that your blood pressure is high even when it's supposed to be lower. Considering how much we've talked about the importance of homeostasis, it should come as no surprise that blood pressure that's too high or too low, or anything that affects your blood's ability to move oxygen around, can be dangerous. Prolonged high blood pressure can damage arterial walls, mess with your circulation, and ultimately endanger your heart, your lungs, brain, kidneys, and nearly every part of you. So I guess you could say that the best way to break a heart is to mess with its pressure. But good luck trying to write a song about that. Today you learned how the heart's ventricles, atria, and valves create a pump that maintains both high and low pressure to circulate blood from the heart to the body through your arteries and bring it back to the heart through your veins. We also talked about what systolic and diastolic blood pressure are and how they're measured. Thanks to our headmaster of learning, Thomas Frank, and to all of our Patreon patrons who help make Crash Course possible for free through their monthly contributions. If you like Crash Course and you want to help us keep making these videos and also maybe want to get some cool stuff, you can check out patreon.com/crashcourse. Crash Course is filmed in the Dr. Cheryl C. Kinney Crash Course studio. This episode was written by Kathleen Yale, edited by Blake T. Pastino, and our consultant is Dr. Brandon Jackson. It was directed by Nicholas Jenkins. The script supervisor and editor is Nicole Sweeney. Our sound designer is Michael Aranda, and the graphics team is Thought Cafe.
Okay. So that is a, kind of brief overview of our cardiovascular system. It's pretty complicated. There's a lot of moving parts there, a lot of labeling that needs to happen. And so that's what we're going to go over today. So looking at it, if we're talking about like what your circulatory system is, right? Sometimes we call it your cardiovascular system, but it is the system that's responsible for circulation throughout the body. It's like, transporting materials that are allowing metabolism to occur everywhere that they need to go. Like we've got to be able to get blood up to our brain so that we can have oxygen delivered and allow our neurons to survive. But then we also need to deliver, blood down to our feet, which are pretty freaking far away from the heart and pretty far away from the brain. And so we have this big, long, sort of closed tube circuit, with a closed system of hollow tubes, where all of that blood is going to travel. And then, sometimes blood will kind of, pop out of that for a second, deliver oxygen to certain tissues, and then pop right back in and, gather all the waste products and carry them with them. And then we actually use our blood to get rid of those waste products. Maybe they run through our kidneys so that like certain hard materials get filtered out of there, or maybe they go up to our lungs, and that's where we drop off things like CO2. So if we're going to have the hollow tubes be our blood vessels, and that's the circulatory portion, right? Then we also have to have like a medium by which to travel everything, and that's where we have like our blood, right? The blood is basically made up of all of these white and red blood cells, but most importantly are the red blood cells in terms of oxygen delivery. I shouldn't say most importantly; it's very important to have an immune system. But your red blood cells are these really cool little cells that are designed to be able to carry oxygen molecules. And so they're very good at binding the oxygen and carrying it around where it needs to go. And they're really good at binding to CO2 and carrying it around to where it needs to go. So that way we can get oxygen from the lungs down to our quadriceps, do a couple lunges, and then, take any of the waste products, which is like CO2, back to the lungs and get rid of it so that we can, do our next set. And then we all, if we're gonna, so now we understand a little bit about the tubes, that everything is traveling. We understand a little bit about the blood. Well, we have to have a pump that's going to actually like move all this stuff around. It's going to power the entire circulatory system, and that's where our heart comes in. This muscular blood pumping organ that is very good at generating and maintaining pressure because it's contractile, very similar to your skeletal muscles. So that makes it very good at creating pressure. But I guess that's actually not the only thing that makes it good at creating pressure. What makes it good at creating pressure is the fact that it contracts, and it does have like valves in it that certain parts of it can like close down. And so that creates like a buildup. It creates a pressure. It's like squeezing this water bottle, and the water, is at the very end. But then all of a sudden, if I were to let the lid off, we go shooting out of there, right? That's what's going to happen in your heart, right? Like the valve is going to open up, and blood's going to go ejecting from one spot to the other. And it's going to fly through those that closed circuit of tubes that we talked about. And that's how we're delivering everything around the body. So your heart, the three pieces here for our cardiovascular system, right, is going to be the heart, which is, like I said, this blood pumping organ that's responsible for creating pressure gradients, and that's going to pump blood and other nutrients throughout the body. There's also a lot of like water in your blood and things like that. Several chambers that create areas of high pressure and areas of low pressure. And so those chambers are where blood kind of fills, and then like the valves like either open up or close down, and that creates pressure and allows it to kind of shoot out of there. Then you get your blood vessels, which is the circulatory portion, a continuous one-way circuit of blood vessels through which blood is pumped by the heart. It is a one-way circuit. Blood is either traveling, away from the heart until it reaches the halfway point, and then suddenly it's traveling back to the heart, and so we've got sort of two different types of blood vessels there: arteries, which are responsible for that carrying away action, and veins, which are responsible for that carrying towards action. But this provides a means by which our blood can kind of travel around the body. We do have a closed circulatory system, by the way, as humans, which means that like it is sort of a hollow network of tubes, right? There are other types of circulatory systems out there, for instance, like spiders, because of the fact that like they'll often swing around like crazy with their webbing and stuff. Have an open vascular system where basically their heart is kind of located in the dead center of their body, and it just kind of splashes blood around whenever it like beats, which is actually really advantageous for a spider, because like I didn't know this, but like they move at super fast speeds compared to like their body size. But this is what's sad. That kind of ruins the fact that Spider-Man, if you were to swing as fast as Spider-Man, you'd probably just pass out halfway, as all of our blood would kind of pool in our legs. Spiders don't really have that problem. So definitely advantages and disadvantages to certain types of circulatory systems, but I think that ours worked pretty well for us, except for when we screwed up with saturated fat and cholesterol and things like that. And then we got our blood, delivering all the nutrients around, right? The medium by which like we are delivering all of this. Our blood cells, very good at carrying these nutrients, right? Very good at exchanging those nutrients with body tissues. And so those three components there are what make up our cardiovascular system. So when I say the cardiovascular system, if we give it a big overall definition, it's the system responsible for consisting of the heart, blood, and blood vessels that is responsible for delivering nutrients throughout the body. That's its real main job. I mean, it is, think about, don't forget that oxygen is a nutrient. Sometimes like it's easy to remember that like carbohydrates, proteins, and fats are our nutrients, but oxygen is arguably the most vital nutrient that we have. You can live a couple days without proteins, fats, or carbs, at all. Well, I'd say you can only go a couple, sometimes in extreme cases, you can go a couple of weeks without any food. You can go maybe a day or two without water, but you can only go a few minutes without oxygen, So it is definitely a very vital nutrient that allows us to do pretty much everything that we do. So we need to be able to be pretty good at extracting that nutrient from the atmosphere and delivering those components around the body. And that's really where our cardiovascular system shines. So your heart itself, like I said, sort of the pump that sort of powers this whole thing. It's located between the lungs and the midline of the body. We sometimes call that area the mediastinum or mediastinum. And then your heart, I know that like when we are, doing the Pledge of Allegiance and stuff, we often like, or Pledge of Allegiance or national anthem or whatever, we'll often place the hand over the left side of our heart, or the left side of our chest, because that's where our heart is. That's not 100% true. Your heart is pretty much dead center in your chest, but it is slightly heavier on this bottom side here, so it does tilt slightly to the left. So more accurately, it would be kind of like this, but then it does kind of tilt over here. So putting your hand over the left side of your heart does make a little bit of sense there. But this is sort of where it's located in between the lungs there. And you can see, this is a pretty tightly packed area. And because of that, because of the fact that like it's, making contact with our lungs and our diaphragm there, like all this stuff is kind of, really close by. We need this thing to generate and maintain pressure. That's hugely important. We cannot let the heart stop generating pressure at any point. This is one of the reasons why, like, you can live without, I think like the line in the first video we watched in this course was like, you can live without an arm, but you cannot live without blood pressure. If you, open up those tubes and just leave them exposed, fluid, because the way like, the universe works, like naturally is going to flow from an area of high pressure to an area of low pressure. So all the fluid's trapped in our body, but then suddenly there's an opening and look at all this atmosphere that it can just move into. And so it just starts rushing out, right? And now your body can't maintain any pressure, which means that it can't deliver oxygen to the right side of your body, your brain, your, whatever. So our heart's really good at maintaining pressure. But we need to make sure that we don't exactly like, screw up that pressure making ability. We don't squeeze the heart down and get it like stuck to the walls of something and then it suddenly can't contract and expand the way it's supposed to. And so there is going to be a lot of layers of our heart. There are going to be like a lot of different specific layers here that make it very good at having like a contractile layer, but also having like a very smooth layer around the outside that is going to keep it from getting stuck to our lungs or getting stuck to any of the tissues that it happens to kind of be beating around in our chest. And then also like we're going to have a smooth inner layer because we don't want any of those blood cells. And we'll talk about blood cells later, but like blood cells have this really cool ability where they can clot together if they stay, immobilized for too long. Well, we definitely don't want them to kind of clump up and get stuck inside the chambers of the heart, because again, that will also prevent us from being able to contract the heart and, relax it and create that pressure and release that pressure, So we need to have a little bit of an understanding of the different layers of our heart when we're looking at its anatomy. So looking at the different layers here, you can see if we're going from the inside out, the first layer we're going to have is what's known as the endocardium. The endocardium is this really smooth innermost layer. So you can see that right here, right? So your heart doesn't just extract oxygen sort of passively, through like the walls here. Like your heart is also made of cells, and so it also needs to have oxygen delivery, right? But it's not able to just kind of passively suck that oxygen out of all the blood while it's sort of stored in the heart. It doesn't really work that way. And so that's why we have our coronary arteries, which you can see here in the picture, kind of blurred out behind this outer layer here. But those coronary arteries are what actually deliver oxygen to the tissues. The endocardium is this really smooth layer. If it was extracting oxygen from there, the types of cells that would have, theoretically that could create like a little bit of like stickiness or friction or texture, stuff that we definitely don't want to have. The innermost part of our heart, we want that to be really, 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 really smooth so that blood can get in very easily and blood can get out very easily. I'm really proud of myself. I just installed a freaking water line after like living in this house for like a year to this refrigerator that we've had this entire time. Uh, because I just finally one day I was bored, watched a video on how to do it, and I was like, oh, that's actually very easy. And so we just installed this freaking water line, but it did take me a couple tries. And at one point, I was putting this line on and like I turned the water on and I heard this like squealing sound where like some water was kind of leaking out. And it was like, due to these areas of high pressure and areas of low pressure. And I connected the pipe ever so slightly imperfectly. And fluid found a way to kind of leak out of there. Well, imagine if like this inner layer of your heart didn't, separate it from like all the tissue in the heart there. We would have like this leaking kind of squealing action, which would then prevent blood from efficiently flowing into and out of the heart. And so like it wouldn't be delivered effectively. Um, it's like a package getting stuck at FedEx. Definitely something we don't want to have happen. Now, the next layer, moving sort of away from the center of the heart there, we start to get into what's called the myocardium. And the myocardium, remember we mentioned this when we talked about muscles the other day. Anytime you hear the word myo, it's going to be, we're kind of in muscle territory, right? And your heart is comprised of like heart muscle. We call it cardiac muscle. It's kind of similar to skeletal muscle, except that if you remember, we sort of split our skeletal muscle into two major categories, right? Type 1 and type 2. Type 1 is your endurance fibers. Type 2 is your heavy, heavy fibers that really drag your skeleton around with like big contractions. But type 1 are the ones that have like lots of mitochondria in them. They have lots of like blood flow, lots of oxidative enzymes, all the stuff that allows them to produce energy and have a goodly amount of endurance. Well, your heart starts beating since before you are born into this world and continues beating 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, decades at a time, nonstop. So, if we've got type 1 and type 2 muscle fibers, this is like type 0.00001 muscle fibers. It's like the true like super endurance fibers. And your myocardium is where we're talking about that, right? This is where the heavy lifting of contraction takes place in your heart. And so cardiac muscle, which is a name for the myocardium, is this lightly striated tissue that looks very similar to skeletal muscle. It does look very similar to skeletal muscle, but just some slight variations here. And so you'll actually see, there's a really good one. Take a look right here. You can see here's our skeletal muscle. You see, it's like these are really big, thick strands, right? And then there's a lot of nuclei. Like there's way more nuclei. Over here, you're not going to see quite as many. The nuclei are very, very much, kind of. I mean, this is like almost a little chaotic over here. But over here, they're very specifically placed. And this is a little bit less tightly packed fibers, right? And what that is the reason for that, the reason there's not as much as many nucleuses. Well, in muscle cells, nuclei sometimes become new muscle fibers or new cellular components. So we definitely need them for that because we want to be able to grow skeletal muscle. But your cardiac muscle, remember the nucleus is like the brain of your cell. It tells your cell how to function, how to operate. And so we need the heart to be able to contract all at once and relax all at once. And so we definitely don't want too many cooks in the kitchen there arguing about who's responsible for what. And so they are lightly striated, which gives them their ability to contract. They have single nuclei. which means that there's not going to be too many people arguing about what sort of direction to take the heart in. It is controlled involuntarily by your autonomic nervous system. You do not have control over your heart. I mean, you have control over some things that can speed up your heart. If you start thinking about, that time that, if you're socially awkward like me, start thinking about that time that you were waving at somebody, but then they were like, hey, and then they were waving at somebody behind you, and you're like, oh God, that's awkward. Like that'll speed up my heart. Or if you think about the fact that just like maybe exercising, which is relevant to us, you start going up a hill, you start producing more lactic acid, your autonomic nervous system says, man, we need to deliver some freaking oxygen better. And so it starts pumping a little bit faster. And then they also have this special material in them called intercalated discs, which we're going to get to in just a little bit here. But intercalated discs look kind of like this. They're these discs that are kind of shaped or kind of situated between our heart cells. Actually, see, here's like a real look at the tissue. Now, these little discs that kind of live in our heart cells there, and they are very good at conducting electricity. And so like your heart, one of the best areas at conducting electricity in your body, does it in a pretty unique way that we're going to talk about here in just a little bit. So that's your myocardium. It's this thick muscular layer where all the real heavy lifting of contraction takes place. And then along the outside, you're going to have your epicardium. This is the thin outermost layer of the heart itself. So we need to be able to kind of separate the myocardium from the innermost layer. That's where we have the endocardium. And then we need to be able to separate the outermost layer from the myocardium as well. And that's where we have our pericardium. Pericardium is this, epicardium. Epicardium is this outer layer right here that is going to sort of separate the sections of our heart, right? So it's the drywall around the outside. Then we do have one more layer around the outside of the heart. Hold on, I'm gonna have to sneeze. I need a light. So we also have our pericardium. So your pericardium is not actually officially part of the heart's anatomy. Like if we think of the heart as like the organ responsible for like, beating and relaxing and stuff, storing blood in like little chambers and things like that. That's what we think about like the heart is for. Your pericardium is not actually officially part of that. Your pericardium is this fibrous sac that's just really there to kind of hold your heart in place. You can see it's this kind of fibrous sac here that's around the outside. And that's great because that means that connective tissue is what keeps our heart in specifically the center of our chest, and that means that it never comes disconnected from any of the blood vessels and tubes and things like that we're attached to. What's up, Gabriel? Good to have you.
Hey, what's up, Brad? My bad.
Hey, no sweat. So those are our different layers, right? We've got the myocardium, that's the muscular layer, the epicardium, that's the outermost layer, endocardium, that's the innermost layer, and then pericardium surrounding the whole thing, kind of holding your heart in place. So that is the pericardium. It's a sac that kind of holds everything. It's connective tissue, just like, fascia is designed to kind of keep your muscles in the direction that they're supposed to travel. That's kind of similar to how your pericardium is. We often talk about fascia as like, we think of it as like muscle. We think of your plantar fasciitis. We think of the fascia that we see in steaks and stuff like silver skin when we're cutting like chicken or steak or whatever. But all of the tissues in your body have some version of fascia. It's there to kind of separate the outermost layers of stuff from the innermost layers of stuff so that those things don't get stuck together, because you're kind of swampy, you're kind of gooey and sticky, I'm sure if you've ever like cut yourself and blood's sticky, much like all the other tissues in your body. So we definitely don't want stuff getting stuck to it. So looking at the myocardium, like I said, myocardium, really, really cool. Structural components of it, you are going to see, like I said, it is lightly striated. When I say that it's lightly striated, you can see here, it does have little striations in it. That's That's a great picture right there. That's really cool. Where you can see like little actin and myosin proteins are overlapping one another the same way that we drew it in when we talked about skeletal muscle the other day, right? We got little sarcomeres inside of our heart. And those, they're not quite as large as, the sarcomeres inside like skeletal muscle, because skeletal muscle has got to be able to drag a freaking bone, holding a 20-pound dumbbell like this, luckily your heart never has to squeeze that hard. And so they have light striations, and then single nuclei, which means there's not too many cooks in the kitchen. And then those intercalated discs allow this electric signal that your heart is going to generate, which causes the contractions in all of your heart cells to travel around very easily. And so we love all those little tiny pieces. So really quick, any questions on any of that so far? Any questions on some of the sort of cellular parts of our heart? Questions, comments, concerns?
All good here.
Feeling good? All righty. So let's go ahead and talk about the pump itself, right? Like, it is a pump, so let's talk about how it functions as a pump. Let's look at what that means. So your heart is full of all these different chambers, right? And those chambers are where blood is going to kind of flow into one area and then move into another area, and then it's going to flow out of the heart and sort of come back into another chamber, flow into like a pumping chamber, and then sort of get it out. So it's almost like your heart has like receiving chambers and it has pumping chambers. The receiving chambers gather blood as it returns to the heart, and the pumping chambers eject that blood to wherever it happens to be going. And it's going to go to two main places. It's either going to go pick up new oxygen and drop off any waste products, or it's going to go deliver oxygen throughout the body and pick up waste products, right? And so that's sort of what we're seeing in this double pump here. So it's sort of a figure eight. It's sort of a double figure eight, actually, when you think about like how your heart pumps, right? Blood goes from heart to lungs to heart to body to heart to lungs to heart to body, over and over and over and over and over again. And so we're going to go sort of divide the chambers of your heart into two main circuits, right? Heart to lungs, that's one circuit, and heart to body, that's another circuit. So first one we're going to talk about is the pulmonary circuit. Pulmonary is a word that means that's when we're talking about our lungs. Your pulmonary system is your respiratory system, or it's your your actual lungs and things like that. And so your pulmonary circuit is responsible for pumping blood to the lungs, right? This is the right side of your heart. And when I say the right side of the heart, you're going to see a picture of it here. I know that it's on we're seeing it on the sort of the left side of this picture here, right? Yes, it's the left side of the picture here. This is the right side of your heart. Remember, this is from the anatomic position, which means facing you. So, the right side of your heart is on the left side of your heart is on the right. I always spend a moment saying that because, like, I don't know if I just wasn't paying attention in school. I don't know if I just like missed that day where we were talking about the hearts or something, but like I missed that detail. And I remember like just like thinking that like having a hard time memorizing the chambers of the heart because like I was just looking at them in what I thought was backwards. And I was like, why is this over here? And it bugged a whole semester of it. Really goofed it up for a while. So I always try to explain that, but you can see this is from the anatomic position. So this is the right and this is the left over here. So the right side of the heart is the pulmonary circuit responsible for pumping blood to the lungs. And it's going to have an atrium and it's going to have a ventricle. So the two chambers, they're the two chamber types that your heart has. It has atriums and it has ventricles. Now, if you look at the word atrium, it literally means it's a gathering site. If I look up atrium here, even though we've been Googling like, heart stuff, you're going to see it's just a bunch of like pictures of like really beautiful areas where like, when someone walks into the lobby, they're going to gather in this area here before they're, seated to wherever it is they're going, right? So that's what an atrium is. Usually, they love to put like trees and stuff in there, but it's a gathering site. It's like a lobby, right? And so your right atrium is going to gather blood as it returns from the body, because remember, this is blood that needs to get to the lungs to pick up new oxygen and drop off, waste products, CO2, right? So the right atrium gathers that blood into the heart as it comes back in. So you can see that's going to happen through this little tube right here. That's called your superior vena cava. And then this tube right here, that's your inferior vena cava. And all the blood is going to come rushing into these two areas once it kind of gets back from delivering oxygen. If I had, blood up in my brain deliver some type of thought or something, well, now it's, used up all of its oxygen and it's picked up a bunch of CO2. So I need to get it back over to the lungs so it can get rid of that CO2 and pick up new oxygen. So it's going to flow through my superior vena cava. It's going to come into this atrium right here. And then you'll see that this atrium has a little valve that is closed down. And so the chamber starts to kind of fill up with blood. And then once this valve opens up, now there's an area of low pressure down here because this is empty. And so all that blood that filled up in here is going to go rushing into this chamber. And this chamber is my right ventricle. This is the chamber that's actually responsible for ejecting blood out of the heart. Take a look at this picture, guys. Do you see how like muscular this section is, right? Look at how much myocardium is surrounding the two ventricles here on the bottom portion of the heart. There's not quite as much up top, right? That's just because these are just kind of empty passive chambers. They don't really need to contract that much. But the bottom part down here, this is where your heart's really going to squeeze, and that's going to, create an area of high pressure inside the heart. And this valve right here that just opened up a second ago is going to close down. This valve right here is going to open up. So now blood's going to try to rush back this way, but it can't because the valve is closed. And so then the valve right here is very open. So blood is going to go, all right, well, I'm going to move to that. And so it's going to fly out through this little tube right here, and it's going to travel through these little arteries right here to either side, and it's going to deliver oxygen or deliver blood to the lungs. And once it's in the lungs, it's going to pick up new oxygen molecules and it's going to drop off all of its CO2. And now it's going to go from being that dark, dark, dark red color to that bright, bright, bright red blood that we sort of think of when we see our blood, So that is the right side of your heart. That's your pulmonary circuit, right? You get the right atrium where we gather blood as it gets back to the heart and then drops it into the right ventricle so that your heart can contract and eject that blood out of the right ventricle over to the lungs. Now we're going to change colors. And we're going to start drawing everything in red because we are about to travel through the systemic circuit. And the systemic circuit is responsible for pumping blood to all of the other systems in the body, throughout the rest of your body, right? This is the left side of your heart, which I know is drawn on the right, but again, give you the explanation of where I was at back in college. So that is your systemic circuit right here. So now, remember that blood, it traveled this way, right? It went out here and left and went over to the lungs. And now it's actually going to come back through these little tubes right here. These are your pulmonary veins, and they're going to deliver blood into the left atrium, which is going to gather it, right? And get it all lumped up. And this valve is closed down currently. So then it starts to fill. Then all of a sudden the valve opens up and, suddenly there's an area of empty low pressure down here. And so blood's going to go great and it's going to naturally flow down here. Then that valve is going to slam shut. The heart is going to contract, and all of a sudden this valve right here is going to open up. And so blood's going to go, all right, well, I'm going to move to the area of low pressure. And so it's going to shoot up out of here. Some of it's going to travel up these little tubes right here, up to the brain. Some of it's going to loop behind the heart, travel down to your digestive tract or skeletal muscle or wherever. But it's going to deliver blood throughout your entire body once it travels through this big tube right here, which is called your aorta. So if we're separating the hearts, there's sort of two ways to think about this, right? You can sort of picture it like a grid, if you want to think of it that way. And so there's sort of two ways to kind of analyze this, right? You can analyze it from left to right, or you can analyze it from top to bottom, however you want to memorize it. is going to be effective. But we've got over here, if this is the, and this is the left side of the heart, and this is the right side of the heart, and this is the left side of the heart, right? You are going to have your right atrium. That's a gathering site. And over here, you are going to have your left atrium, right? Then over here, you are going to have your right ventricle. And over here, you are going to have your left ventricle, right? So now, if you remember these little factoids about this, if you remember that like atriums are up top and ventricles are down below, and if you remember their function, atriums gather stuff, ventricles pump stuff away. If you remember those two rules, oh, and then if you remember that like left is on one side and right is on the other, sort of opposites of one another. If you remember those rules, it will be very easy for you to remember the chambers of the heart. In fact, what I always tell people to do, if you don't want to spend all this time sort of memorizing all these chambers, just pay attention to this one, your left ventricle. That is the one that is probably the most famous. That's the one that's most relevant to us. Your left ventricle is the chamber of the heart that's responsible for ejecting blood out of the heart so that it can literally deliver oxygen to everywhere around your body. Your left ventricle, you'll notice it's also much more muscular. Look at this. See how your left ventricle, look at the walls surrounding this portion of the heart. It's way thicker than the walls surrounding this portion of the heart over here. Your right ventricle, it's got to pump blood, ventricles pump blood out of the heart. The right ventricle's got to pump it a couple inches over to your lungs. Your left ventricle has to pump it several feet, sometimes against gravity, up to your brain. It's got to get it all the way down to your, friggin' right pinky toe. That's about as far away as it can go, but that's several feet away. So the left ventricle is much, much, much more muscular. So they can facilitate a much stronger contraction. So it can really make sure that blood is traveling over long distances. So if you forget any of the chambers of the heart, try to remember the left ventricle, because then you can kind of logic out, you can kind of fill out the rest of the heart. You're like, okay, well, what's the opposite of left? Well, the opposite of left is going to be right, and I need to have two ventricles because I need to pump blood in opposite directions. So that means that the other chamber is going to be the right ventricle. And then if you're like, all right, well, where am I getting blood from? I got to be able to gather blood as it comes back. The opposite of a ventricle would be an atrium. And so the left atrium is going to be attached to the left ventricle. And since I already figured out my right ventricle is over here, my right atrium is going to be connected to my right ventricle. So if you memorize just this one box, you can figure out all three other boxes there. Or if you, in other words, if you can remember this one chamber, you'll be able to remember the other chambers. And like I said, guys, unfortunately, you do actually want to have a pretty good understanding of what these chambers do, not because, your clients are going to quiz you, but because these are the types of information that make very good test questions. I'm going to go on one brief little rant here. It is similar to how, if you remember, like I thought I hated history class. I thought like history was my least favorite type of class when I was in school. I remember being in school and just being like, God, I hate history. You just memorize like what date this battle happened, what date this happened, what the name of some freaking general was, the name of the battle, and blah, 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 blah. And it's like, just memorization, because those are the things that make really good multiple choice test questions. It's very easy to write a question and say like, what year did the Battle of 1812 happen? Like, and then 4 options. It's a great, easy question for teachers to make. But like, it does not tell you anything about like why that battle happened or like the economic impacts or social impacts that it had on this world. And then like I started studying history in a different way and realized I was like, oh, this is actually really fun once I, don't give a crap about memorizing battles. I need you guys to understand how the heart functions. And that's what's important. Unfortunately, what makes really good test questions is like, which chamber receives blood as it returns from the body? So there is a little bit of memorization that has to happen here. NASM's going to quiz you on it. So get these chambers memorized for sure. Gabriel, do you have a question? I saw you come unmuted. Do you have a question?
Oh no, I was just really like trying to look at the details of this heart diagram and stuff. That's all it was.
No sweat, no sweat. So anyway, that's there's my little rant. There's my little soapbox. I'm off of it. But yes, get those chambers memorized. Think of it, and honestly, think of it like 4 boxes. That's the easiest way to kind of remember this. Like, you guys know me. I can't like draw to save my life. And so like a lot of times, I will often draw like a Valentine's Day heart, and then just kind of fill it with chambers, like boop, and then we'll put this chamber here. But it's not too far off from how your actual sort of heart looks, right? You got these 4 big chambers here, running out of like the appropriate shapes here. We'll use the thought bubble for this one, and there you go. There's sort of the main chambers of your heart. It is sort of like 4 boxes, so if you want to draw Valentine's Day hearts, it actually works pretty well. Even though your heart sort of looks something more kind of like this. All right. And then obviously we can't, if we're talking about those chambers, it is very important to talk about those valves as well. Luckily, NASM does not make you memorize the valves, even though they are also a very important part of things. But don't worry about memorizing, the difference between your atrioventricular valves, your tricuspid valves, or anything like that. But basically, the valves are what are responsible for generating that pressure, right? In the same way that, like, if I've got my lid on this water bottle and I squeeze it and it starts generating a whole bunch of pressure, this is a valve that's preventing that pressure from being able to move out. But if I open it, if I undo the lid, well, now I open that valve up, water's going to come shooting out of there, right? So that's great if I want to create pressure and I want that water to like travel from one area to another. If I got a super soaker in my hand, right? Yeah, that's awesome. Love pressure when we're, playing with super soakers, and so like there's a valve there that's kind of closed down. And then when you open it up, that causes that blood to really go ejecting out of there. Now let's talk a little bit more about something that's, hyper relevant to us in our jobs, your coronary arteries. So I mentioned it earlier, and we're going to talk more about it here in a little bit, but arteries are the blood vessels that are allowing blood to travel away from the heart. Okay. In the same way that like we have sort of 2 sides of the heart, we have 2 major types of blood vessels. Arteries, which are traveling away from the heart, veins, which are traveling towards the heart. And we'll get to that in just a little bit. But your coronary arteries are probably the most important arteries in your body because, yes, they are traveling away from the heart, but they loop immediately around. They have this short little loop. And you can actually see that right here, right? This is kind of the backside of your heart here. And you can see there's the aorta. So blood gets ejected out of this. And then look at this little branch right here. Some of that blood's going to travel up to the brain. Some of it's going to kind of loop around and go to the rest of the body there. But this little branch, right, immediately breaks off and then it covers the heart tissue itself. Like I said earlier, your heart cannot just passively suck oxygen like out of the chambers there. We need to, this is made of human tissue, and human tissue needs a lot of oxygen in order to survive. Well, you're not getting that oxygen by just having blood cells in these chambers passively. Instead, your heart is just like any other tissue in that it needs to be covered in blood vessels so that it can get oxygen delivered to it. And so those are your coronary arteries. So this is the blood tissue that or the blood vessels that deliver oxygen to the tissues that keep the freaking pump alive. And so that's where we talk about like Coronary heart disease, that's the buildup of plaque on the inside of the walls of these blood vessels, where we diminish that oxygen's ability to travel around. This is what we're talking about when we talk about heart disease, what causes heart attacks, right? When we look at like coronary artery disease, it looks like this, you know. Actually, that was a great picture right there on the front of Google. You know, where we see the blood vessels around the coronary, they get these fatty deposits that limit blood flow. Now blood can't travel easily because now there's high pressure in an area that should have been low pressure. And if it ever gets a full blockage, you know, if it ever completely ends up like blocking enough like this, well, blood cells, which are designed to clot when they stop moving, start to clot up. And now this whole thing gets plugged and blood should be flowing, you know, from left to right here. But then all of a sudden it hits this and starts backflowing, and that's not great. And so then all of a sudden the heart tissue doesn't get delivery of nutrients. And we start to see, you know, sort of what we're seeing here, which is like necrosis or cell death of like these tissues because they basically suffocate. So that's what coronary artery disease is, right? It literally kills your heart cells because they don't get oxygen delivery. We need to make sure that we keep our coronary arteries healthy. And we're going to do that through like a healthy diet and exercise and things like that. They're going to have very, very positive effects on our heart. And there's another example of like those valves closing and opening and stuff. But so any questions on any of that, on those chambers? Do we need to spend a couple seconds more on that? Anybody got anything? Are you guys feeling good?
No, I'm feeling good.
Love that. Thumbs up from Bay. Thomas and Lorraine, you guys are feeling good?
Good.
Love it. All right. Well, let's go ahead and look at a cardiac cycle, right? Let's look at how the heart's actually sort of pumping, right? Because it's sort of it's a repeating process. It's got to start happening, like I said, before you were born, and it's going to keep happening 24 hours a day until you're done, you know? And so if we look at a heartbeat here, and yeah, we're going to see a lot of gifs like this, but no. Here's sort of a detailed picture here, right? So here's what your heart actually kind of looks like. And you'll notice it kind of pumps, it kind of goes from like top to bottom, kind of pumps something kind of like this. It's slightly off on the timing, right? It's not that the whole heart squeezes and then the whole heart relaxes. If that happens, we wouldn't be creating areas of high pressure in one spot and an area of low pressure in another, and so nothing would move around. So you'll see the top of your heart kind of contracts before the bottom of your heart. It's sort of this, you know, action like this, it's like bump, and then like then this, and then like as this is relaxing, this one finishes squeezing. So it's sort of on a delay there, right? So there are sort of two phases to your cardiac cycle. There is the active phase and the passive phase, right? So cardiac cycle is the series of events that are occurring. You have the contraction and the relaxation, right? And so that is what we refer to as systole and diastole. Now, the important part of this, like I said, the most famous part of your heart, the part that we really talk the most about is where we are talking about that left ventricle. Remember, the left ventricle is what pumps blood out you know, to your entire body, right? That's the left ventricle's got to deliver it, you know, away to the various tissues that are very far away. Your right ventricle also has to pump blood away from the heart, but you know, it's only going a couple inches. So that is actually where we measure blood pressure. When we say like systole and diastole, systole is the contraction of the heart and diastole is the relaxation. So when you are measuring someone's blood pressure, we always put, you know, that cuff on their arm, right? And you are measuring the left ventricle's pressure when it squeezes, and you're measuring the left ventricle's pressure when it relaxes. And that's what we use a blood pressure cuff for, right? So this is kind of what that looks like, right? During diastole, when the heart relaxes, the chambers in the atriums here, they open up. And so that allows blood to kind of flow in and gather into the heart. Because the heart opens and there's nothing in the heart currently, lots of empty space. That's an area of low pressure. And stuff always travels from high pressure to low pressure. So all of a sudden blood comes rushing in. And then this chamber of the heart down here, the ventricles will open up as well. And that'll cause blood to rush down here. Then these valves are going to both slam shut. And then your heart is going to systole, it's going to squeeze. And that squeezing action is going to eject blood out of the heart in the right side here over to the lungs, or in the left side here out to your entire body. And so that's the pressure that we're talking about. Now, we do need to be able to measure how well our heart is actually functioning. And so when we're talking about the function of the heart, we're going to be looking at two main things. We're going to be looking at how often you can beat and how much blood you can pump per beat. Let's say you're imagining, imagine for me, you are measuring the efficiency of a delivery company, right? Like FedEx, DHL, whatever, you know? So you're imagining, like, how are you going to measure how well a company can, deliver Amazon packages, right? It's going to be based on how many trucks and people they have to like drive those trucks, and how well those trucks can actually freaking travel. How like much distance they can cover. And so like those are the two things you're going to consider. You're going to consider like how many delivery drivers they have, and how often they can actually get that freaking delivery to occur. Well, the same thing is true of your heart. When we consider like how your heart actually functions, the two main things that we consider are how much blood can you pump every time your heart squeezes once, and how many times can your heart beat? How often does it happen? So that is what we refer to as your cardiac output. This is the overall performance of the heart, the overall function of the heart. And it's made up, and we write that in Q, because like mathematically that's called a quotient. So you don't always see it. And in fact, in this slide here, it doesn't. This is the thing. This is where like, we are using two different textbooks here. And so clearly those textbooks are slightly disagreeing with each other. You'll notice like they have this equation written here, which is cardiac output equals stroke volume times heart rate. NASM is going to write that differently. NASM is going to write it as Q, which represents cardiac output, is heart rate times stroke volume. And if you wonder why, it's because technically it's a quotient of blood. That's where the letter Q comes from. It's super annoying. It's driven me crazy for years. I actually brought it up when I talked to NASA. I was like, did you guys update that in the new textbook? And they were like, no. And I was like, anyway, so cardiac output is the overall performance of the heart. It's made up of two things. It is how much blood you are pumping per beat and how often you are able to beat the heart. So it's a measurement of the amount of blood that you can pump per minute, because you think about like how often something has, that's a measurement of time, right? So that's like, something we would measure in seconds or in minutes or whatever. That's your heartbeats per second, your heartbeat per minute, whatever. And then we think about like the amount, that's a volume, right? So that's the volume of blood per a section of time. And we usually refer to our heartbeats in BPMs, that's beats per minute. So your stroke volume is the amount of blood pumped out of the heart per beat, and your heart rate is the number of beats per minute. If you guys forget everything I tell you today, but you remember like one concept, I would say this is probably the most important, because as trainers, what is very relevant to us is like the function of the performance of the heart, right? So we care a lot about, like, when we are training our clients, what's our main goal? To improve their cardiac output, right? Now, I would say like we can't necessarily measure stroke volume in the gym. We just don't have the sophisticated equipment. It would be very difficult for us to be able to like measure how much blood is being ejected out of the heart every single time their heart beats. So measuring stroke volume is really, really difficult. But we know that we can measure something that's very easy, which is your heart rate. You put 2 fingers on the side of your neck right here, and you're going to feel your pulse, right? You put 2 fingers on the side of your wrist right here, you're going to feel your pulse. And so we were able to count that pretty easily in the gym. Now, if I had, let's say, a delivery driver, or let's say I got a delivery company and I need to deliver 10 packages and I've only got 1 driver to do it, he's going to drive like a freaking madman. He's going to have to like travel so fast to get all that work done in such a short period of time. So if you think about like how fast he's traveling as analogous to like, how fast your heart is beating, we now know it's like, oh man, that's not very efficient. That means that poor guy is having to deliver all of these packages and drive at the speed of light, to get it freaking done. Why didn't we just deliver more packages all at once? If we had like 2 drivers delivering 2 packages simultaneously, they can travel at half the speed, right? Like they don't have to do 100 miles an hour. They can both do 50 miles an hour. They can travel much, much slower because they're delivering more packages simultaneously. Well, let's look back at our heart. If we're delivering more blood every time our heart beats, our heart doesn't have to beat as often. And that's what we are paying attention to. Your stroke volume is really important. And even though we can't measure it, if I make you do 10 squats and your heart's beating like crazy after only 10 squats, that shows me that your heart's having a hard time keeping up. It has to beat more often because every time it beats, it's like, makes it kind of a weak, wimpy contraction. So not much blood gets pumped to where it's going. But if I make you do 10 squats and your heart's like kind of at a slow rhythm, it's like, man, you delivered the same amount of oxygen, but you were able to do it in 3 heartbeats, rather than delivering that much oxygen in 50 heartbeats, right? And that's why we pay attention when we do fitness assessments. We pay attention to what our client's pulse is. We put them through a specific amount of stress, whether it's walking a mile or stepping up onto a step for 3 minutes. We put our clients through these fitness assessments, and then we measure what their heart rate is at the end of that assessment. And it's like, all right, like let's say Lorianne and I both get on the treadmill at the same time. We both hit 4 miles per hour on that treadmill at the same time, and we both go for exactly 1 mile. Both of us experience the exact same amount of stress, right? It's 1 mile, 4 miles per hour. It'll take us both the same length of time. But if Lorianne's heart is pumping kind of slow and mine's over there like this, that shows us that she's in better cardiovascular shape because her cardiac output would be higher than mine, right? She is able to deliver more blood per minute than I am able to because my heart doesn't pump very hard. And that means that I need to do my cardio,
Thanks for making me a healthy one.
What's that?
And thanks for making me the healthy one.
Of course. Of course. Are you kidding me? Yeah, heck yeah. We got friggin' fitness goals in this class, this is not this is trainer school, not trainee school, but still. Absolutely. So here's the thing. When I say that, when we're talking about your heart and when we're talking about like how it is contracting, all of this is occurring the same way any tissue inside of your body is happening, right? We talked about the nervous system the other day. Your nervous system zaps stuff. It uses electrochemical signals, right? Your heart your nerve cell will create a little bit of electricity, and then it'll travel with that electricity to wherever it happens to be going. Your heart does the same thing, but it does it in kind of a cool way, actually. So really quickly, I'm just going to pull up a picture of a sodium potassium pump here. All of your nerve cells have these different pumps. They have sodium potassium pumps. I want to see one with 2 different colors, please. Come on, internet. Uh, there we go. That gives me the colored one. So take a look right here. We got 3, different colors of proteins, right? Purple and red and green here. And these little proteins push electrolytes, sodium and potassium, from one side to the other. And so when you flip them around, that's what creates the electricity, right? Now this takes a lot of ATP. This burns up a little bit of energy in order to move actually pump those pumps, right? When those proteins change shape, it takes some energy. So it takes a little bit of ATP. And that's true of your heart cells as well. But what's kind of cool about your heart is that your heart's cells actually leak a little bit. They leak sodium and potassium rather than just completely separating them. And so when your heart changes shape on a big level, like your heart's squeezing, right? And the cells are kind of being stretched around and moving a little bit, that changes this, that drags the proteins open with them. So what's funny is your heart beating keeps your heart beating. It's almost a perpetual motion machine. It's not perfect. It can't do this completely on its own, but it's kind of like those little, what's that perpetual motion like bird thing? Do you remember that episode of The Simpsons? From it was like the 2nd season. A perpetual bird drinking. You ever see these? My dad had one of these on his desk. And what it would do is it would there's a little fluid in here, and that fluid would, kind of move to one side. And so this little thing, you'd start it moving once and then it would never really stop until it ran out of water, right? Because that water would flow down and drip down here, and then that would make it heavier. So then it would fall backwards, but then, and it would just do that. My dad loved that thing. And that is kind of how your heart works. It's a very it's a very weird thing. I actually told my dad that I used to use this as an example in my lectures, and he loved it. Your heart has these leaky sodium potassium channels that allow sodium to flow in one direction and potassium to flow in another, because your heart got done beating last time. And so we need to be able to control the rate at which this happens, because we need to sometimes speed our heart up if we're doing a lot of work, or slow our heart down if we're trying to rest, and so you have this electric system. We call it a conduction system that conducts electricity throughout your entire heart. And so your heart is really good at producing electricity, because of these leaky sodium and potassium channels. But we need to be able to control when our heart beats under our nervous system. And so your nervous system is connected to your cardiovascular system with these little nodes right here. Particularly the one you want to pay attention to is your sinoatrial node, or your SA node. That's what everybody calls it. So your SA node is the pacemaker of your heart. It's this little bundle right here. It's this little node. It lives in your right atrium. And you'll notice some of the wires run across the top of the heart, and then some of the other wires run down here. And then they hit this little other node right here. That's your AV node. Your AV node actually delays the signal for a second. Now, we just talked about how important it is to run electricity through the heart, but weirdly, we have this thing in our hearts that stops the signal for just a second. It insulates the signal for just a millisecond or two. Not a very long amount of time. But that's actually really important, because we want the top of the heart to contract first, and we want the bottom of the heart to contract second. So this initiates the signal, this delays it for a second, then the top of the heart is finished with its contraction, and then the signal finally travels down, and then that's where the bottom of the heart, finishes its contraction. So it'll travel to the, what's going to happen is the signal is going to start at the SA node. travel across the top of the heart, travel down here to the AV node where the signal will be delayed for just a second. Then it will travel over to here where it will hit this other little bundle. We call that the bundle of His, which is a really cool freaking name. And then it branches out from there, to all of these different fibers. We call those your Purkinje fibers. But the big one you guys need to know, the one they like to test you on, is the sinoatrial node. It's the pacemaker of the heart. It regulates your heart's rhythm. So when you're watching like a medical drama or TV show or something, and somebody comes into the ER and they're like, clear, and they get those electric paddles and they're like, and they zap them, right? So what that's actually doing, what's kind of funny is people think that, actually, you know what? I know that Bay, Lorianne, Thomas, I know you guys have heard this before. Gabriel, I'm gonna ask you, because I don't think you've heard this before. What is happening when they zap your heart in those, using those paddles? What's happening? What are they doing?
Well, I always like seeing in like movies and stuff. Like I believe that basically they're trying to recharge your heart, right? Like they're trying to like jumpstart it in the sense of like get it going again in a sense.
So here's what's crazy. You're close. You're really close. They are kind of trying to jumpstart your heart. But what's funny is you think of jumpstarting, it's dead and it's not going anymore, right?
Right.
You jumpstart a battery, you brought a little bit of the juice back to life.
Juice back in, yeah.
Right? Your heart doesn't quite work that way. What's funny about like when someone's having a heart attack, and for the record, nothing's funny, but what's interesting about it, right, is that your heart's actually not pumping. It's actually pumping a lot. It's trying to contract, but it's quivering. It's going like this instead of like bump, 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 bump. 1, 2, 3, 4. Instead of doing that, which is like a great rhythm that generates pressure and then moves blood around, it's just quivering. It's all like what has happened in a heart attack is that sinoatrial node, that pacemaker, he's lost control of the orchestra. Like everybody's playing at a different time. They're singing the wrong notes over there. The drummer's timing is off. Everything's screwed up, right? No one's playing in sync with one another. So now the heart's quivering. We call that fibrillation. And it's just, going like crazy. So what's actually happening, and this is what's kind of crazy, those paddles, they don't start your heart, they stop your heart. It runs so much electricity through your heart all at once that it's like simultaneously with like, if you're, you think of like a conductor, right? It's like all of a sudden they were like, hey, shut up on my signal, go at this rhythm. Right? It's like when you're in school, and like everybody's talking and like your teacher's like, hush,
Well, I got a question though.
Yeah.
If that's the case, how come like people can't find a heart? Like they do it, they ask for the what do you call it? They ask for the paddles and stuff because they can't detect the heart.
Yeah, they can't feel a pulse, right? They can't feel a pulse because the heart's not squeezing hard enough to actually like pump blood where it's going. The pulse that you're feeling, like when you put your fingers like right here on your wrist, right? That pulse that you're feeling is blood being ejected. So because the heart's kind of quivering, these chambers aren't opening and they're not closing. So then blood flows a little bit out, but then it kind of flows back. And then and it's not moving where it needs to go. So no blood's actually rushing in the direction it's supposed to go. So we need that pacemaker. We need that sinoatrial node to get everybody back in rhythm. I need this to squeeze and I need this to be open so that blood moves down here. Then I need this to squeeze, which will shoot blood out of the heart. And then I need this to open, which will draw more blood back in. Then I need this to open so that the cycle can repeat. Boom, 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 right? And if I can't do that, if I'm just going like this, blood's going in every which way. And it's not actually flowing in the way it is. So they're not starting your heart with the paddles. They're stopping it for a second. That allows the pacemaker you know, it's like blowing an air horn and everybody's like, what was that? You know, everybody like shuts up, right? And then all of a sudden, the sinoatrial node, you know, gets everything going again. Hopefully. Sometimes, you know, if it's been going, if the cells are damaged long enough because of fibrillation, well then, you know, your sinoatrial node's got nothing to contract with, and there's nothing we can do about that. But that's what the pacemaker of the heart is, you know. Oh Lord. Sorry, 1 second. I got a text from Sochi. Oh, okay, that's not so bad. They were like, make sure everybody's wearing their masks. And I was like, oh, what's going on? I thought there was like an outbreak at Sochi. Not the case. Not the case. We're fine. Just a precautionary tale. Okay. So yeah, so the pacemaker, the sinoatrial node, it's a special node that regulates your heart's rhythm. So this actually, you guys might remember I was saying this the other day, when, you know, you start walking uphill, right? And all of a sudden, because you're walking uphill, you're recruiting new muscles. More muscle now needs more oxygen delivered to it, right? Because those cells need to be able to produce a little bit of energy to cause their contraction. So the harder you start working, the more oxygen you need. And so your body starts producing lactic acid as a byproduct of that energy production. You're producing more energy to contract more cells. And so now there's more lactic acid. It's running through your blood, and it runs past that sinoatrial node. And when the sinoatrial node experiences blood that's a little more acidic tasting than it should be, that's what signals it to pick up the pace. And that's why your heart rate is autonomic. You don't have control over that, you know, but your nervous system is just like, woo, yeah, we need to pick up the pace, right? We need to deliver more oxygen so that we bring the acidity levels back down. And then there's other things too, like hormones and adrenaline and neurotransmitters, all kinds of, any material that kind of runs past. It gets, you know, the SA node there is kind of there to taste things and say like, oh yeah, like we need to pick up the pace. Or like, you know, like, hey, like let's slow it down a little bit. Let's be efficient, you know? We're in a resting mode. So that is all autonomic. Any questions on any of that, guys? How are we feeling?
Feel good.
Yeah, awesome.
Feeling good.
Love it. All right, and here's those things. By the way, actually, I just realized I kind of moved past them. The autonomic stuff. Your sympathetic autonomic section. Remember, that's the fight or flight system. That speeds your heart rate up. The parasympathetic slows it down. And your endocrine system, your hormones play a role in this as well, right? Like epinephrine, that's adrenaline, it speeds your heart up. And then thyroxine, that's also kind of part of adrenaline. Hormones are so incestuous. That also kind of speeds up your heart. But like things like oxytocin, dopamine, serotonin, those slow your heart rate down. So that's how your brain is connected to these little internodal pathways here, you know? Okay, so this is going to go through a little bit of medication. We're going to kind of move through these slides a little bit quick just because they're not super relevant to us. But, you know, how are you going to treat heart disease? The big one that is relevant to us, this one right here, lifestyle changes, right? Well, you know, if you've got gunk build up in the blood vessels of your lungs, what should you do? Clean that gunk out, right? How do we clean gunk out of stuff? We run fluid through it a little bit more often, right? We create a little bit of high pressure. So if you exercise, which picks up your heart, you're going to pump more blood through there, and it's going to knock that crap off the walls. It's like running high pressure water, you know, through a system. Eventually it kind of breaks through, you know, or maybe we're going to eat materials, you know, like high fiber, which creates these like really healthy fatty acid chains. And those fatty acids are going to go through, and they're really dense, right? Really high density cholesterol, HDL, good cholesterol. You're going to get the good cholesterol, bad cholesterol, right? The good stuff comes along, knocks that crap off the walls, right? Cleans out your heart. That's what we're going for. Those are the lifestyle changes. So diet and exercise, right? Healthy proteins, healthy fats, healthy carbs, lots of physical activity. That's how we're going to strengthen our heart. We're going to clean it out. And then, yeah, there's things like statins and anticoagulants. If you ever know somebody who's having a heart attack, for instance, a lot of times, you can give them an aspirin and it will make their blood a little thinner. Aspirin draws a lot of water into your blood. That's how it works. And that can thin out your blood, making it easier to pump. So if your heart is fibrillating and they are having a heart attack, making blood a little bit easier to flow can have a pretty positive effect there. There's nitroglycerin, beta blockers, antidiuretics, calcium channel blockers. There's a lot of different things out there. There's pacemakers. There's literal pacemakers. Where they'll literally put, instead of your nervous system doing it, they'll put something like this under your skin. And this little guy is going to, sense what your heartbeat is. And anytime it gets off rhythm, it's going to slap it and go, and zap it and get it going. So it actually sort of acts like the SA node for you and sort of wakes it up, and then there's obviously all kinds of different surgeries and stuff like that. But like I said, we are trying to get our clients to avoid any of those things rather than take those. Sometimes they'll do what's called a coronary bypass. You can see here, they'll sometimes connect a blood vessel from here. If this blood vessel is like damaged or blocked or something like that, and it can't deliver the way it's supposed to, they'll sometimes connect a blood vessel from somewhere else. They'll do this, which is called an angioplasty, where they'll actually thread a balloon sometimes into those arteries, and then they inflate that balloon, and that opens the tube back up, and now there's able to get blood in there. And oftentimes when they do that, they'll put what's called a stent in there, which is basically this like little framework that goes in really thin, and then when it opens, it clicks open and it stays, and then stays open, and then that stent forces your blood vessel from, rather than being collapsed down, it kind of keeps it open. So anyway, that's that in a nutshell. All right, let's go ahead and move into the circulatory portion of things, right? So let's look at our blood vessels here. So when it comes to circulation, we do have a lot of different types of blood vessels out there. You've got arteries, which are, like I said, those little blood vessels traveling away from the heart. When blood is flowing away from the heart, it's traveling through an artery. When blood's traveling towards the heart, it's traveling through a vein. So, you can see your veins pretty clearly. They're usually a little closer to the surface of your skin. Arteries, a little bit larger, but that's what you can feel. They're usually a little bit deeper, which is good because, those are the highest areas of pressure. So keeping them, kind of deeper is good. But when you feel right here, you are feeling an artery, and that's when you're feeling like blood rush through that artery, and that's your pulse. But we do also have capillaries. Capillaries are the actual exchange sites. Those are microscopic, and we'll talk about those more in detail in just a second. And honestly, that's actually pretty much the big thing we're going to talk about. We will talk about the blood pressure, how much pressure is in these blood vessels, but for the most part, that's actually what we just want to know. We want to make sure we memorize what these vessels are and what direction they're kind of traveling in. So your vascular system, your circulatory system, your blood vessels are this closed circuit of tubes, right? And like I said, it's all connected to the heart. It's closed circuit, right? Like the end of the circuit is the heart in both ends. And, the rest of it is like your tissues and stuff. So blood is going from heart to lungs to heart to body, heart to lungs to heart to body, right? Over and over and over and over again. It's a big double figure eight, And so, like I said, the blood vessel types that we've got arteries. Arteries are blood vessels that always are carrying blood away from the heart. Generally, you can see in this picture here, look at how much of this is like red. This is for the most part, most arteries are red. However, there are your pulmonary arteries right here where blood's flowing out of the heart to the lungs. Those we draw in blue. That's the only time deoxygenated blood is traveling through an artery. The rest of the time, for the most part, oxygenated blood, is traveling around throughout the body. And the same thing is true of on the flip side. You got very oxygenated blood traveling towards the heart. These are your pulmonary veins. That's the only time in the body that blood is traveling towards the heart when it actually has lots of oxygen. It's this short little trip right here. But most of the time when blood's flowing back to the heart, it's getting back to the heart because it has no oxygen. It's just delivered it at your heads and your arm or wherever, So arteries are always, this is a direction-based thing, not an oxygen or deoxygen-based thing. It's a direction-based thing. Arteries are blood vessels that are traveling away from the heart, always, always, always. Now, we do have a special name for a small branch of an artery. You can see here, this artery will kind of branch down and become like a little bit of a smaller section here. Kind of like in the same way that like a freeway will branch off into like a surface street. That is what we call an arterial. Okay, so an arterial is, a little bit smaller than a freeway, surface street's a little bit smaller than a freeway, but this is a smaller branch. And then eventually it'll get really small and it'll get microscopic. And that's what we consider like a driveway, like a driveway is really tiny, really short, and that's like going to form what we call a capillary bed. So a capillary is a microscopic blood vessel that will cover your tissues. They form these beds, and those beds cover tissues, and that's actually where blood is being exchanged. So if we look at a capillary bed here, yeah, they look something kind of like this, right? You can see like this would be like an artery becoming an arterial, and then it would branch down, and then it would just cover tissues. Let's see here. I guess that kind of works. It's kind of the same picture, but you can kind of see there's a little bit of tissue in the background there, right? There's some, it would be this webbing that kind of covers your cells. When we look at like, you ever look at the body, if you've ever been to the bodies exhibit, if you ever get a chance, guys, I totally recommend going. It is incredible. It's super cool. But you can see, like, look at how much of it is just covered in, these capillary beds, right? They absolutely cover our tissues, no pun intended, but head to toe, and so those capillary beds are the actual exchange site where this is all actually, kind of dropping off oxygen or picking up CO2 or, whatever it happens to be doing. Then they're going to start to come back together, right? They're going to start to, once they kind of exchange everything here in the middle, they start to come back together. They don't have any oxygen anymore. So now they got to get back to the heart. And so that's where they're going to travel through veins. Veins are blood vessels that carry blood back towards the heart. And then the smaller branches of your veins are what are known as venules, and they're small versions, right? So, you travel down a freeway to somebody's house and then you get off a surface street and then eventually you pull into their driveway and then you're going home. You pull out of the driveway, go down some more surface streets. Those are kind of like venules. Get back on a freeway, and that's kind of like a vein. One's northbound, one's southbound, I guess. So there are some unique veins that you'll sometimes see. You'll see like veins will have these special materials in them, right? These little valves right here. That's actually pretty cool. The cool thing about veins, because here's the thing, arteries are much thicker. One of the things that's kind of different between like an artery and different from a vein, arteries, you can see here, like look at the walls here. They're way, way, way thicker, right? And arteries are much larger than veins are. And that's because like, that's where the pressure is the highest, there's a lot of pressure coming out of the heart when it squeezes. And there's very little pressure traveling back towards the heart. So, because of that, we have these special little valves here which prevent blood from backflowing. Like when you think about like your heart squeezing, a lot of pressure, blood's shooting out of the heart. But you think about like a sucking action, you know, pulling that blood back to the heart, there's just not a lot of pressure there. And so because of these veins, that keeps blood from backflowing. So if blood were to like travel up a tube and then like, you know, your heart rests for a second, that blood would fall back down that tube. It'd fall back down because of gravity, right? But luckily you'll have these little valves there that kind of close down, like they're kind of shaped like this. And so they open up to allow blood through, and then that kind of closes back down, and that keeps blood from backflowing. But occasionally those valves will get stretched out. Sometimes blood will start pooling, and if your heart's really weak and it can't pull that blood against gravity back to your heart, you will sometimes see what is called a varicose vein. And a varicose vein is what happens when basically blood starts pooling and it pulls those valves apart. And that stretches out your blood vessels, and it looks something kind of like this. It's really freaking painful, where blood's kind of pool, you know, these vessels are getting stretched out. Yeah, pretty rough to look at. Yeah, it's painful, you know, but they can fix it. They can, you know, they can fix it. And you can prevent this from happening, you know, through, you know, healthy diet and exercise. Keep your heart healthy, and it's going to pull blood back to your heart, no problem, you know. But that's kind of what it looks like. You can see the vessels kind of get all stretched out, because like these, you can see the valves here, right? But now here they're kind of being pulled apart because blood maybe traveled up and then just way too much of it started falling backwards.
Genetic hereditary.
And it is yeah, for sure. Some people have thicker blood vessel walls than others, you know, makes it easier to maintain that pressure. Also, some people's are a little bit more on the surface, I think. So I think sometimes, like when it's, you know, we talk about how it's hereditary sometimes. It's part of it is like, it's like, I don't know if your varicose veins are larger, but they're definitely on the surface. And so yours are easier to see. So there's a little bit of that as well. So those are our blood vessel types, right? Again, arteries away, veins towards, capillaries in the middle. You got a couple, and then we got the different circuits there. You don't have to worry about that. Don't worry about the tunics. That's another one, the different layers. Your blood vessels open and you know, they dilate and they constrict, and they kind of go in like different directions there. They have like these different tunics that kind of twist like this that allow them to kind of open and allow them to close, kind of like the lens of a camera, actually. And there you can see the difference between like the sizes. You can see there's an artery, much thicker walls, the pressure is much higher. And then the veins, we actually want the walls to be a little thinner. So the pressure, because the pressure is lower, we don't want there to be any resistance. You know, so this prevents that wall from, you know, kind of tearing by being nice and thick, because there's a lot of pressure here. And then over here, it's, you know, much thinner. Biggest artery in your body, by the way, is going to be your aorta. It's that branch that goes right off of the heart there. You can see this is your aortic arch right here. So as blood goes shooting out right there, this big loop, that's your biggest aorta. It's actually kind of about the size of about a garden hose, actually. But that thick tube right there is we refer to that as the aorta. That's your biggest, thickest artery in your body. And then you can see it kind of loops up, picks up gravity, and then drops down and goes to wherever it needs to go. Or some of it will travel up to the brain, becoming like, you can see here, you know, that's your subclavian arteries here, you know, traveling up to the brain. Or maybe it's your carotid artery. That's the one that we actually feel. Your carotid artery is the one that we actually like test your pulse with sometimes. Or maybe it'll travel down and, you know, go to your liver, your kidneys, or wherever it happens to be going. And there's a bunch of different branches, you know, that branch out from that. And we do study those branches, but like not in our job. And then there's just like another really cool picture you can see, right? So it's going to travel out and around. And then the same thing is true of your veins, right? They're going to travel back towards the heart, and they're going to dump it in. That there's the inferior vena cava, and there's the superior one. There's your liver, by the way. This is what we call your hepatic portal system. This is my favorite name in the body. This is my favorite, I think, in terms of pieces of anatomy. So your liver is actually where your body recycles your red blood cells. Like we talked about how your skeletal system makes your red blood cells, right? But like, where does it get all the ingredients for that? Well, some of it's from your diet, and your body can just make those materials. But your body's also trying to recycle any old damaged blood cells. So certain blood cells, once they get bad at carrying oxygen, they get bad at delivering nutrients, they get they run through your liver at one point, and they go to this area that is the coolest name. They call it the red blood cell graveyard. That is its actual scientific name, which I've always thought is the best name in the world for like a heavy metal band. Like, I would love to have a heavy metal band named the Red Blood Cell Graveyard. And that's where like those ingredients kind of get like, picked up and then delivered to your bones, and your bones go make new red blood cells and stuff. So talking about how we actually exchange nutrients, right? When we are exchanging nutrients in your capillaries, right? Your capillaries are dropping off oxygen and picking up CO2 if it's at the body's tissues, or if it's at the lungs, it's picking up, if it's at the lungs, it's picking up oxygen, dropping off CO2. If it's at the body, like if it's a tissue, your bicep, your tricep, whatever, it's going to drop off oxygen and pick up CO2, right? How the heck do we exchange those nutrients? Well, you guys might remember, I think it was our second lesson in this class, we talked about the idea of diffusion, right? Diffusion is going to describe how nutrients, and basically any material, will always move from an area of high pressure to an area of low pressure. So because there is a lot of oxygen in your lungs and very little oxygen in your blood, oxygen naturally wants to move into your cells. And because at a body's tissue level, at your quadriceps, there's actually very little oxygen in the tissues, and there's a lot of oxygen in the blood, well, then the oxygen moves out of the blood into the tissue. Meanwhile, the exact opposite is true of CO2. There's very little CO2 in the blood, but there's a lot of CO2 in the tissue, so then that CO2 moves into the blood, and then that blood cell travels to the heart, and then travels to the lungs, and then the lungs, there's like a lot of oxygen and very little CO2, so the CO2 moves out of the blood cell, and that whole process kind of repeats. So let's put everything together today and kind of track a blood cell, like a brand new blood cell that was just born, through its journey through the heart and through the body for the first time. So let's say you make a new red blood cell. First thing it's going to do is it's going to travel through a vein to get to the heart for the first time, because veins travel towards the heart. So that blood cell is going to travel to the heart, and then it's going to go into the right atrium where it'll get gathered. It'll drop into the right ventricle where it'll get pumped out when the heart squeezes over to the lungs. And for the very first time, that red blood cell is going to pick up oxygen. And so it's going to pick up some oxygen, and then it's going to get sucked back into the heart, gather into the left atrium, where it'll get gathered up with a bunch of other red blood cells. It'll drop into the left ventricle, then the heart, that's the real muscular part, is going to squeeze, and that will eject out of the left ventricle, up the aortic arch, out wherever it happens to be going. Let's say it's going to go over to your right calf muscle. And so that blood cell is going to travel down to the right calf muscle. It's going to drop off all that oxygen it picked up earlier to your calf. It's going to pick up some CO2 from your calf, and then it's going to travel back into a vein where it'll get back to the heart for the second time. And it's going to go from heart to body to heart to lungs to heart to body to heart to lungs, over and over and over again until it gets worn out and ends up in that red blood cell graveyard. And that is sort of what's happening there. And that's all happening because of diffusion. Diffusion is describing, you guys remember I told you, rules of the universe. Form follows function, right? Always remember, or function follows form. Always remember that. And then always remember, nature hates gradients. Nature will always move something from high to low, always, until everything is nice and even. And that's the whole process of diffusion there. Now, in these blood vessels, we do have vasodilation, which is opening of a blood vessel, and we have vasoconstriction, which is the closing of blood vessels. And that is what allows us to move oxygen to wherever we need it when we need it. So if I go eat a cheeseburger right now, my digestive system is going to need to start doing work. So all of a sudden, the blood is going to increase blood flow, that I'm going to experience vasodilation in my digestive system. And that will allow more blood to get to the digestive system, which will allow the digestive system to do more work. Now, if I start going for a jog, my body will actually constrict the blood vessels in my digestive system, and it will expand the blood vessels in my muscles that I'm using to go on that jog, because it needs to deliver oxygen. And so that's where our body is maintaining pressure through dilation and constriction. So some of this, by the way, has a little bit of help from your actual muscles. One of the other cool things about your veins, the reason your veins are a little bit more surface and why you can see them a little bit more, they do sometimes run past certain muscles. For instance, the calf, where blood is, look at how far away from your heart that is. It's not close. And it's got to work against gravity to get all the way back to the heart, right? Which is not easy. So your calf muscles need, when they actually squeeze and they actually contract, that actually squeezes your veins. And again, makes it a little bit easier to travel and get that blood to your heart. If you've ever seen videos of people standing at attention in like the military, and then all of a sudden they like pass out, that is because they were locking their knees and they stopped squeezing their calf muscles. So blood started pooling in their legs and their brain was like, I need oxygen. And so it's like, it's a lot easier if it's traveling this way than if it's traveling this way. So you should lay down. And so that's why people faint, which is, sort of what's going on there physiologically. So your pulse, your actual like pulse that we are sensing is whenever the left ventricle is squeezing and blood is traveling, ejecting out of the heart. We're either going to feel that here, we're going to feel that here. That's influenced by a lot of different things, your gender, your body size, your age. As we get older, our heart gets a little bit larger, and so it slows down. When we're younger, our heart's a little bit smaller, and so it's very speedy. That's why kids have a much faster heart rate than adults do. Your body size plays a part of that. Your blood pressure plays a role in that. If your cardiac output has like a lot of resistance to blood flow, your heart has to beat more often because not much blood can travel through the vessels, right? So this is why it's so important for us to pay attention to blood pressure. So remember, we've got systole, that's the contraction of the heart, and we got diastole, that's the relaxation of the heart. So we have two places where we're measuring that pressure. When your heart squeezes, we call that your systolic blood pressure. It's the amount of pressure pushing on the walls when your heart is contracting. That should be around 120 units of pressure, right? Ideally. And then we have the pressure when your heart is relaxing. There's still pressure, there's still blood in your blood vessels. It's just there's much less pressure pushing on them because the heart's in a relaxed position. That is your diastolic blood pressure. And so that should be around 80 units of pressure. And ideally, our blood pressure will be somewhere between 120 over 80. 120 is the contraction part, 80 is the relaxation part. Now, if it's as high as like 140 over 90, because maybe there's, resistance to that blood, maybe you've less blood right now, maybe you just like didn't drink enough water, so your blood volume's a little bit low. Maybe your blood vessels are not very elastic because you have a super high sodium diet. And so that sodium is starting to build up little crystals on your blood vessels and now stiffening them and making them harder. Or maybe stress is doing that. Or maybe you just have a bunch of plaque in your blood vessels. Well, then the pressure is going to go much higher because the same amount of blood is going to move through a much smaller tube. So pressure is going to be way higher. If it ever gets to around 140 over 90, that is what we refer to as hypertension. And that is dangerous. That can damage your heart. That means that you are not so good at moving blood around. When I, talked about like exercising, that constricts the blood vessels to my digestive system and dilates the blood vessels to my muscles. If I'm not good at changing that pressure, if I'm not good at that dilation or good at that dilation or good at that constriction, I'm not going to be very good at moving blood around, which means blood might start pooling in one part of the body or another. And then if it's pooling, it's not delivering. And if it's not delivering, my cells are not surviving. And that's what causes stroke and heart attack and, all kinds of problems. For the record, your pressure can be low too. You can have hypotension, although we don't see it quite as often. So when that happens, we do experience some vascular disorders. Arteriosclerosis, right? That's the buildup of plaque on those blood vessels. If you get these like fatty streaks and plaque starts building up, that, look at how much that's going to limit how much blood can flow through there. So the pressure is going to be much higher, and that can create like damages and stuff. You'll sometimes see an aneurysm. That's actually where if there's blood is really not able to travel through, picture if you've ever like taken like a balloon or something and you've been running water through it and you squeeze one side, it starts to build up and expand in that one other section, right? That's what we call an aneurysm. And if that bursts, well, then all of a sudden you cannot maintain blood pressure. And that's, it's often the end of things. Varicose veins, like I said, that's like the stretching out of those blood vessels, those veins in particular. There's a lot of diseases of blood vessels. We'll be looking at those next mod, much more in depth. But best advice, guys, keep your heart strong, keep your vascular system strong. Diet, that's going to put materials into your body that cleans your blood vessels out. Exercise, that's going to make your blood vessels good at dilating and good at constricting. It's going to keep your heart strong, and it's going to also clean your blood vessels out. That's why that stuff's so important. And that's this kind of stuff that, we're looking at this kind of heavy duty anatomy, but that's what's going to help us, sort of understand these processes a lot better. Why does exercise, make your heart stronger? Well, it makes it contract more often. So then it actually develops more actin and myosin proteins, and it pumps blood through consistency, which cleans out the walls on the vessels, and that's what we want. And that's about it today, guys. Thumbs up from Bay. Gabriel, Lorianne, Thomas, you guys got any questions?
No, I'm good. I learned a lot today, though, to be honest.
The big one.
Doing good.
Yeah.
Same note, Brock. Pretty clear.
Cool, guys. All right. Well, I'm going to let you all out of here. This video will go up in a couple hours. You guys can rewatch it if you need to. Yeah, Gabriel, this is only like your third day. So it's going to feel like a lot. But yeah, it's like I said, the first 12 days are speedy and then it starts to slow down a little bit.